imagine how Congress, how your local state legislatures and other positions in all your different communities across the country, imagine how different that would look if over 70% of 18 to 29-year-old, 29, is that right? 18 to 29-year-olds voted every election. I mean, think of how different your priorities are. Not always, but oftentimes, right? Every poll I've seen, the priorities of 18 to 29, very different from over 60. So you want to change the world? Start out, I urge you to get, be a regular voter, get involved in elections, be a poll worker, be a poll watcher. It just may change your life like it did mine.
My distinct honor to introduce to you Kathy Boockvar. Kathy Boockvar is the president of Athena Strategies. You have all sort of taken a look at her bio and hopefully did more looking at her background, but I'll just tell you a little bit about her. Kathy Boockvar is the Senior Election Security Advisor at the Brennan Center for Justice. I highly recommend that you go to their website. They have outstanding analysis and objective research about voting rights in the United States. And Kathy Boockvar is extremely qualified for that job because her former job was to be the Secretary of the State of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, one of those states that I mentioned where there was a very tight election and a lot of election controversy, and she was one of those independent secretaries of state that played it right by the book and had to face a lot of political pressure. And I think we should, in fact, I deeply admire Kathy Boockvar for her role in that election. She led the Pennsylvania Department of State, which is a statewide agency with a $120 million budget and 500 employees, to implement, secure a resilient and accessible election in Pennsylvania, to protect the health and safety of the public through professional licensure, and support economic development through corporate and charitable filings and transactions. And I hope you'll join me in giving a very, very warm Washington Center welcome to Kathy Boockvar.
Morning, everybody. I heard a lot of words, I caught the end of that, and I heard a lot of words that you're going to hear repeated by me, such as engagement, 18 to 29. This seems to be a good, how many of you in this room are in that age group, may I ask? All right, can I ask the next question? How many of you voted in 2022? That's excellent. That looks like more than the 29 or so percent that's been reported. And of course, the timeliness of the topic of this year, the state of our democracy, feels like it could not be more timely. I sort of wish that wasn't the case, right? That there could just be an assumption that I could get up here and I could say the state of our democracy is strong. Not quite there yet. So I wish I could, but what I do believe, and this is really important for all of you being here today and being engaged in these areas, is I do believe we are heading in a much better direction this year than we were a year ago and 2 years ago. And that means a lot. And that's thanks to a lot of you. So I've been asked to come here to speak about election security and democracy with a bit of a subtitle of how we got to where we are today. And I'm going to do my best both to shed light on how we got here, where we are, and hopefully we can talk about where we're going. And I will leave plenty of time at the end for you to ask questions. And there are microphones, so please don't hold back. When I get to the end, line up, ask me whatever questions are on your mind. This is what we need to be doing. We need to be talking about these issues. So, as I said, I do believe we're heading in a better direction than we were a year ago and 2 years ago. And we have a lot to feel good about what happened at the national level in the last 6 months to a year. But there are also patterns that show that there's still much work to be done. And all of us, every single one of us, can help. So I'm going to start with the look back. It's 2020 and the aftermath. It's sort of the elephant in the room. Here we are, 2 days short of 2 years after January 6, 2021, a day that will live in infamy. 2 years after a violent assault was wrought on our Capitol, interrupting Congress's constitutional obligation to carry out the will of the voters. An assault that was incited 100% on lies that were intentionally spread to subvert the will of the voters and to undermine people's faith in our democracy. 2 years after a record number of lawsuits were brought all over the country, where scores of federal, state, and local judges, Republican and Democratic, heard and rejected dozens and dozens and dozens of frivolous challenges to the 2020 general election. Every single claim of fraud was thrown out, every single one, no matter whether it was a federal court, a state court, a county court, Republican, Democratic judge. The courts found zero evidence upholding any allegations that were frankly fictitious, alleging fraud. And throughout the last 2 years, we've also seen an unprecedented number of recounts, audits, challenges, sham investigations, and every other type of analysis that you could possibly think of to carry out regarding the 2020 election. What have we learned from all these? None of this has uncovered any significant discrepancies, revealed any material fraud, or identified any factors that impacted any election outcomes in 2020. I'll say that one more time. Not one. So 2 years later, are we moving forward? There are certainly hopeful signs, but there's still much more work to be done. And I'll talk about both the hopeful signs and the challenges. So one hopeful sign that we've seen in the last year or so is the movement to hold lawyers and parties accountable for spreading false allegations and bringing fictitious claims. So 2 years after Rudy Giuliani made overt misrepresentations in federal court in a coordinated effort to disenfranchise millions of voters, he's finally facing attorney disciplinary hearings against him. And in these hearings, he still has the audacity to claim that he has been persecuted for years, and he's still unintelligibly claiming that the courts were wrong. And I just want to be clear, like, these are the same courts who who extensively looked at all he brought and all the teams brought. And some of the quotes in these cases, did any of you watch the January 6 hearings? Okay. So if you haven't, they're all available. They're all recorded. Highly recommended. I never watched things like this on TV. I know it sounds weird. Somebody who's been in government and politics for the last many years, I never watched this stuff. But you know what? I couldn't watch them in the minute that they were on, but I watched the recordings, and it's worth it. You learn so much, and you see so much of the workings of all the different parts of what happened in the lead up to January 6th. So if you haven't, really highly recommend it. But so on the screen a couple of times on the hearings for the January 6th hearings were some of these quotes. And they're quite something. So these were Republican judges, federal judges in Pennsylvania who heard the Giuliani cases, and some of the quotes that they said in their findings against against Giuliani in those cases were, one of them said, charges require specific allegations and then proof. We have neither here. Like, that's just said flat out in the decision. Another judge said, in the United States of America, this cannot justify the disenfranchisement of a single voter, let alone all the voters of the sixth most populated state. And we should also be disciplining and holding accountable all officials for their roles and treacheries to subvert the democratic process, right? Our country is based on democracy. This is who we are. And so if we're not holding accountable those that are actively working to subvert that, to say the will of the people does not hold, we need to hold them accountable. And we've seen from recently unsealed text messages, the January 6th committee reports, and lots of other sources that there are actually sitting congressmen, state legislators, and other officials, including, frankly, many who won re-election in 2020 in the very election that they sought to undermine and to overturn, the active roles they played. All officials should stand accountable for such gravely anti-American and seditious actions. Spreading these lies is not only unethical and unpatriotic, but it's also dangerous. Obviously, they as I've already said, they provoked the January 6th assault, but they also help our foreign adversaries. So for those of you that are interested in national security, this is something that we haven't been talking about that much. And I can tell you, as having been in the Department of State in Pennsylvania since 2018, when we first started talking about election security in 2017, 2018, was when the elections were declared critical infrastructure by the federal government. And we really started, election officials started having to think about election security and what that meant. A lot of it was focused on foreign adversaries, China, Iran, Russia, and what they might do to try to infiltrate or impact our elections. When we do it ourselves, domestic actors, and when we allow our officials to do that, we're literally handing a gift on a platter to our foreign adversaries who could then amplify what's being done by domestic actors. So I can't overstate how important it is to hold everyone accountable for taking these actions. Okay, so that's sort of the look back, and now I'm going to talk about the current times and the 2020 midterms. And it's been 2 months or so since the 2020 elections, and I want to talk about what are some of the most significant things we've seen, we've learned, and accomplished. So let's start with all of you. According to analysis by Tufts University Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, CIRCLE, 27% of people aged 18 to 29 voted in this year's midterms. It definitely seemed higher than that here, so great. But this is the second highest youth turnout rate in midterms in the past 3 decades at least. 2018 was the highest. 31% of young voters turned out in 2018. So I think this is simultaneously fantastic and depressing. Second highest turnout, yay. 27%. So let's come back to this later. I think we can do better than 27%. Other good news from the recent election cycle. Cybersecurity held strong. Thankfully, there were no major cyber emergencies on or around Election Day. There, of course, were efforts to cause damage. There always are every single day. Denial of service actions, plenty of phishing and smishing. I don't know if some of you have gotten them by text message, but you have to be just as worried, if not more these days, about what comes in on your cell phone, because we're so used to quickly responding when something comes in via text. But now adversaries and people trying to hack in are learning how to use that to get people to give personal information or other ways for them to get in. So anyway, that all happens every day. Nothing was different, but I was happy to see that nothing significantly out of the ordinary happened on the cyber front. On the good news and bad news front, I'll talk now about election deniers. So the good news is that many candidates who ran for governor and secretary of state, positions where they would have a role in certification of statewide elections, many candidates who ran for governor and secretary of state who, based on election denial and false narratives, lost their races in 2022, and that's great news. However, there's bad news too. It's sort of gone below the radar. But according to the Washington Post, more than 170 election deniers won their races for Congress, Senate, and other key statewide races. 170. Not to mention many more at the local levels. So in battleground states, this back to the good news, in battleground states, most of those who could have had a role in statewide election certification lost, governors and secretaries of state. However, election deniers will oversee elections in at least 4 states. All of these, and the overwhelming majority of election deniers who won at the state level were incumbents and were in red states. But, you know, in Pennsylvania alone, every 6 out of 7, I think, of our Republican congressmen were election deniers, like currently. So, like, and that's, if you look at states across, and obviously Pennsylvania is a purple state, very, very purple. So 170 is a lot. And it's a significant issue that we still need to be dealing with. Okay, local level. So I'll start out by saying, you know, we're going to be, you know, we're talking about 2020, we're talking about 2022, but there actually are, you know, odd year elections. So, and this year, 2023, is really, really important, and a lot of people don't know it, but the local, so in most states, and I'll get to this a little bit later, there's our elections are very decentralized, and a lot of the authority is actually at the local level. So the elections for a lot of county and local election officials are this year in 2023. So I'm not going to focus on that here, but as you're thinking about elections, I urge you to look into that, because a lot of the swing states, including Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota and others, we do have really critical races this year. But anyway, so what are some of the issues we saw in 2022? At the local level, we saw new avenues for local challenges and delays that we really haven't seen this level of kind of baseless local petitions. And they were filed after the 2022 election, and a lot of them didn't even try to allege any particular fraud. They just filed the petitions wherever they could, really as a source of delay more than anything else. The good news is, you know, again, no fraud, no evidence of anything has been turned up, but it was a source of delay, not to mention cost and effort and resources. So it's something we're going to have to deal with before 2024, because obviously delays in presidential elections are more fraught than in other years. Okay, back on the good news front, we've got the reform to the Electoral Count Act. So the new law, hopefully you all saw that as part of the appropriations bill, Congress passed these reforms. The new law confirms that the vice president has no power to alter the electoral vote count that is certified by the states. It raises the threshold for how many House and Senate members are needed to object to a slate of electors from the states. Provides for expediting judicial review if a state government unlawfully refuses to certify results. And it prevents state governments from changing rules after an election has been held. So these are all really, really big wins for a democracy. And so in short, it's going to restrict the ability for election denying officials to try to subvert the will of the people, like happened in 2021. And one more piece of good news, I'll just say on the legislative front, Congress passed as part of the infrastructure bill a little over a year ago, the first ever state and local cybersecurity grant program. So it provided for $1 billion over 4 years. And it's really to help state and local governments address and prevent cybersecurity risks and threats. And 80% of it has to go to local jurisdictions. And there's also a requirement that of the dollars overall that each state gets, 25% has to go to rural areas. And I know that sounds weird because 80% and 25% don't add up, but there's overlap in that 80 and 25, right? So And this is really good news because we want to make sure that those that have the least resources, which are often our weakest links, right, that they have the resources to build cybersecurity protections. Okay, so looking forward, I mentioned that all of us can help. So I want to really focus on some ways that we all can help play a role. So I heard in the prior presentation, get engaged. I think you're probably going to be hearing this a lot. And the fact that you're here and this room is packed is going to be, is a very good sign. But I just want to say my first job in elections was as a poll worker. And it changed my life. It literally changed my life. You never feel like you're more of the part of the wheel of democracy as you do when you are literally helping people vote. And and it's sort of, it's empowering and exciting and addicting. And a few years later, I became a voting rights lawyer. And, I hadn't been doing voting rights before that. I had been doing other areas of law, but I was so excited by the elections and voting rights that I became a voting rights lawyer. And then I learned about all the many county and state officials that were working in Pennsylvania across the country. So then some years later, I was asked by Pennsylvania Governor Wolf to serve as Secretary of State and Chief Election Official, which was the experience of a lifetime. And now I get to work at the federal level on election security and voting rights. And I can tell you that none of it would have happened if I had not first been a poll worker. And that never would have happened if I had not first been a regular voter. Regular voter starting in my late teens as soon as I was eligible to vote. And it was only because I was a regular voter that some poll workers who were working asked me if I would come serve, and I said yes. So it gets us back to turnout, right? I said I would circle back on the 27% in your age group. And I also looked at 2020 numbers because a lot of the 2022 numbers and the demographics of age and all the other demographics are not quite done yet. But I looked at 2020 and a little over 50% of your age group voted in 2020, which is far better, obviously. But you know what percent of my age group voted in 2020? It was over 70%. And nearly 80% of people over 60 voted in 2020. Oh, nearly 80% of people over 60. Imagine how Congress, how your local state legislatures and other positions in all your different communities across the country, imagine how different that would look if over 70% of 18 to 29-year-old, 29, is that right? 18 to 29-year-olds voted every election. I mean, think of how different your priorities are. Not always, but oftentimes, right? Every poll I've seen, the priorities of 18 to 29, very different from over 60. So you want to change the world? Start out, I urge you to be a regular voter, get involved in elections, be a poll worker, be a poll watcher. It just may change your life like it did mine. Okay, second thing you can do. Urge your elected leaders to increase support for election officials and election administration. Election officials are still facing threats and harassment. I'm sure you've probably heard a lot about this. I won't spend a lot of time talking about it. My family and I faced a lot of threats as when I was Secretary of State. There were times that my husband and I had to leave our house. We left our house for a week at a time because we were afraid to be home. I was afraid to walk the dog. It's really awful. And I have to tell you, even since I've left, my family and I have still gotten threats. This is unacceptable. It's anti-American. It's so, election officials are some of the best human beings on the planet, and without them, we literally would have no democracy. So we need to provide support to our election officials, both on the physical security front and also on the overall election administration front. And there are some expanded resources being offered. So things are better. I started out by saying things are better than a year ago and 2 years ago. We are seeing some increased resources from Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, the FBI. Other partners have popped up. I've been honored to be part of a cross-sector collaboration called the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections. You should check out their website. It's a collaboration of law enforcement and election officials and federal agencies, all committed to making sure that we can support both election officials and law enforcement and connect them, because together we'll strengthen all of our physical security if we know that the resources and connections are there. So check out their website. There's a lot of good stuff there, but it's not enough. We also need financial support across the board for election officials. We need elections to be funded like a lot of other things. It needs to be a long-term continuous investment. A 2021 analysis by the Election Infrastructure Initiative found that election needs at the local and state level over the next decade are a full $53 billion with a B dollars. $53 billion is what we need. And we don't have anywhere near that. The funds are needed for everything, to safeguard election systems, update equipment, systems, facilities, ensure there's well-trained staff. We hope to get money in the infrastructure package that passed in the fall of 2021, but it didn't happen, unfortunately. What we were asking for was not $53 billion, but $20 billion over 10 years. But all we've gotten basically in this most recent round of appropriations was we'd asked for $400 million in this 1 year of appropriations, and all that Congress appropriated was $75 million for elections. It's like, that barely covers, one jurisdiction, let alone the whole country. So please advocate to your election official, to your legislative and state level leaders that we need more funding. Accountability. I already talked about it. We need more accountability for those that propagate false claims. There are some good patterns. We've seen similar disciplinary cases, as I already mentioned with Giuliani, are also happening with Sidney Powell, John Eastman, and others. I would love for us to be creative, and you guys can help with this. I would love for us to be doing research on other bodies that could help hold accountable. Like Pennsylvania has a state ethics commission. I think probably most states have some version of that. Those bodies could also be holding officials accountable. I feel like every profession expects a certain level of ethical behavior and truth, not telling lies of their professional members. Why can't we expect that from our legislators, from our, other elected leaders? So please help figure out ways to do that. And then last is really calling out disinformation when we see it and helping to spread accurate information. So, I think, it's every day we see the integrity of our election process and our public servants under attack. And we need to be sharing information that's accurate. And it's to just amplify understanding and discourse about elections. So I thought it might be helpful to give you all just some talking points to help share broadly, and then I'll stop and take questions. So as I mentioned, first, a reminder that our elections are decentralized. So we've got federal laws, we've got state laws, but a lot happens at the local level, and it's actually designed to be different. So it's totally normal that one person who votes a certain way in certain hours and certain methods in a small town in Tennessee is going to be different than a person who votes in California. And that's across the country. That's normal. There's actually approximately 9,000 jurisdictions running elections in the United States. And I'm not exaggerating, 9,000. I thought in Pennsylvania we had a lot to manage with 67 counties managing 67 elections, but other states are even more locally managed. So Wisconsin has about 1,900 election jurisdictions. Michigan has about 1,600 election jurisdictions. Maine, 500. So the complexity, we need to be talking about the complexity and diversity as a strength, because think of how hard it would be to actually, impact 9,000 different elections, right? To actually have an impact on the national election, it would literally be impossible. There's 9,000 different people and processes and machines and all that stuff. This is a strength. And the reality is that Americans can and should trust the election process in our country more than ever before, because it's actually more secure, stronger, and more transparent than it's ever been. How do I know that? It comes down to three things: the people, the science, and the math. So I said earlier, I've had the privilege of working with the people of our elections at every level, from the most local in the precincts as a poll worker to the most national across the country. And I can tell you with my broad experience, in no uncertain terms, that the people, our election officials, work harder than almost everybody else I know to ensure that we can exercise our fundamental right to vote. Elections are not run by a dictator or sorcerer in the back room who's waving their wand and changing votes. That's not how it works in this country. Our election officials are our friends and our neighbors. They coach our kids on the soccer field. We see them at the store and at the gym. They work tirelessly in bipartisan teams to make sure our democracy runs. I also talked some about the cross-sector relationships and collaborations. These are critical in running our elections. The people are phenomenal in elections. So I said the people, the science, and the math. So next I'm going to the science. When I talk about the science of elections and how strong it is, I'm talking about both what I call hard science, such as cybersecurity, and process science, such as all the multi-tiers levels of processes that are in place to run our elections. So on the cyber and hard science front, election officials and our partners are engaging in practices now that either didn't exist or nobody had any idea about 10 years ago. Penetration testing of voting systems, logic and accuracy testing of voting systems every election, 24/7 network monitoring, intrusion detection systems, all kinds of things make this the strongest, cyber protections as possible. Also the strongest information sharing across the country. So we're making sure that if federal officials or state officials have information about a threat, it gets down to all those local jurisdictions that I was talking about so that they can be protecting all of us as well. On the process side, the process science side, election officials employ multi-layered processes that build in security and verification at every step of the election process. And again, the complexity of it is intentional because the complexity makes it stronger. So I'm just going to give a quick example. In 2020, before the 2020 election, I was sitting in a room full of law enforcement officials at every level. There were, U.S. attorneys, there were FBI, there were state, police, every kind. We were there to talk about ways we could collaborate and be prepared for the 2020 election. And some of the folks in the room, I started out by saying, tell me, are there particular things that you're concerned about? And of course, it was 2020, though not that much has changed. A little bit has changed. The issue that they brought up was, tell us where we're going to see fraud for vote by mail. And I said, what are you hearing? And they looked at each other, and it was clear in 2 seconds that they had no idea how vote by mail worked in Pennsylvania. And so I said, would it be helpful for me to just tell you all the processes that go into it? And, a lot of head nodding. So I went through the whole process. I told them that in Pennsylvania, we don't just mail ballots to people. People have to apply. They have to be checked against either the driver's license database or the Social Security database. They have to be checked against the voter database before they even get a ballot. The ballot envelope is coded with a barcode that is only tied to that voter. So if the voter does, after the voter is qualified, if they do choose to return the ballot, when they send it back, the barcode has to be scanned, and if it's matched to an approved voter and whatever qualifications are met, then it's counted. If there's no barcode or the barcode doesn't match, the ballot's not counted, plain and simple. So do you remember in 2020 and since, when there were, these crazy allegations of truckloads of ballots being driven in from out of state somewhere? And I was like, you could bring in 1,000 truckloads of ballots with, made up, mail-in ballots. if when they get to the county, if there's no barcode or there's a barcode that's not tied to a approved voter who actually applied for that ballot and was granted, the right to have one, they wouldn't be counted. But this is the kind of thing we need to be talking about, right? And I have to tell you, every person, I can't tell you how many people in that room came up to me afterwards and said, we had no idea, right? So, and by the way, lately you've probably been hearing about mail ballot epiphanies, right? Suddenly, we have all these deeply polarized theories about who votes, who's benefiting from what method and what type of voting is secure or not secure. The truth is everybody's realizing what election officials have known all along, which is every method that works for you is a good method. And when you encourage voters to come out and use whatever method that they can do, they will vote in greater numbers. And whether it's a red state like Kentucky, which saw a red wave this year, and they expanded mail-in voting and early voting, or a blue or a purple state, it's good for voters. Okay, and last, the math. So I said the people, the science and the math. I'm going to fill you in on a big, big secret. Elections are all about math. It's not rocket science, right? In Pennsylvania, we've got 67 counties. They each run their elections. They add up the votes. They certify the votes. They send it to us. We put it in a spreadsheet. We add them together. And the candidate with the most votes wins. I know it sounds crazy, right? But of course, there's also more than that, right? There's audits and reconciliations and making sure that the number of voters doesn't exceed the number of ballots doesn't exceed the number of voters and all that. But basically, it's all checkable. It's all math. So thanks to the people, the science, and the math, we can all have confidence that our fundamental right to vote is strong and that our votes are being cast and counted securely and accurately. All right, so I think I'm going to not go into my conclusion because I really want to take questions. But I just want to thank you all for being out there. And please continue to fight for our country and fight for our democracy. Thank you very much. All right, I think, were you first in line? All right, so I'm going to start. I'm going to alternate right and left sides of the room. Sir.
Hi, good morning. It's a pleasure to meet you and to hear your conversation. Thank you for everything you do to protect our election security. My name is Maximus de Medici from Harvard University Extension. And as a congressional staffer, I have also faced some of those threats, when we have our press conferences. What do we do? What can we do to reassure those Americans who are truly concerned about our election security? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry for your experiences as well. I mean, it's really shocking, isn't it, that we're even having this conversation? So I think, I talked a little bit about the advances that we have made. So one of the things, going back to, I mentioned the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, which again, you check out their website. So for me personally, one of the things that helped me is I was very fortunate that I knew I could contact. But part of the problem is jurisdictional issues. So for example, I worked in Harrisburg, which is in one county. I lived 2 hours away. I had family members in other states who also were getting threats. And so none of law enforcement at the time really knew who even had jurisdiction to handle any of this stuff, right? And the FBI was starting to get involved, but it wasn't set up. We need to do more. There's more clarity now. And entities like the FBI are taking a more active role. I have heard of the FBI actually showing up in a good way, showing up at election offices to offer help and to ask questions to help them. So I knew my local police, my state police, the FBI liaison, all these people, we need to connect the locals and the states and the feds better to make sure that you know who to call, that the law enforcement knows what your normal is and what your not normal is, right? So that they understand the hours of operation, what your staff is doing. We need to make sure that the physical security, obviously, of places like the Capitol, right? That seems like something we shouldn't even have to talk about, but obviously it's still an issue. The Capitol, election offices, other places have the physical, the basic physical. We didn't used to have to worry about cameras and, and then there's also CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, has some good resources on de-escalation training and training for election officials and other officials to make sure we know how to recognize public behavior that is outside the ordinary, so we know when to make that call, to push that panic button, what have you. I can't even believe that we have to be having these conversations, but we need to be doing all of that. So I urge you to check out this, and I'm happy to share. I've got a list of resources that if the Washington Center wants it, I will send the Washington Center the list. It's a whole bunch of different stuff that may be helpful to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, how about this side of the room?
Good morning.
Hi.
My name is Kat Murphy. I am a second-year journalism political science student at Quinnipiac. So you talked a lot about accountability, and I want to point out that you actually resigned shortly after the 2020 election for an unrelated issue. It was departmental oversight for which you took responsibility despite acknowledging that you weren't aware of it. And so as much as you talk about accountability, I want to point out that you took that responsibility to the highest level in resigning your position as Secretary of State. But I do want to ask you how you think it's possible that we can that American democracy can survive the ad hominem attacks and political aggression that we see today, especially amid the political polarization against election officials and, just state level officials.
It's like $1 million question right there. I think there's not one answer, right? It's all the things we talked about. And it's why things like turnout, that stuff is arguably more important than anything else, but it can't be done to the exclusion of everything else, right? So we need you out there. Yes, I did. I took responsibility for something that technically was not my action, but it's because I believed that accountability is the cornerstone of leadership. And I want to see that everywhere. And we should be able to expect that of our officials, right? So I want us all out there demanding more from our officials. And I'm not talking about demanding A+. I'm talking about telling the truth, right? Is that too much to expect of folks? I'm asking people to demand that we don't have active efforts to overturn an election. Is that too much to ask of people? So, but one of the things I was going to say in my conclusion actually is this is a good, after January 6, 2021, I was, as you might imagine, very depressed. I'm sure a lot of us were. But in part that was because it felt like we were surrounded by all these people who were trying to tear down our democracy. And I was speechless. I didn't even know how to talk about it for a couple of days. And then the more I started talking with people, the more I realized, no, actually, for every one of them, there are far more of us, far more people who want to build and strengthen our democracy, who want to make sure that we are as strong as we could possibly be and getting accurate information out there. But guess what? We are a lot quieter than they are. That's a huge part of the problem. So we need to be out there, and it's why I wanted to spend time talking about the truths, because we need to be talking about that. We need to be sharing that information. We need to be making sure that our voices are louder than those that are trying to tear it down. And if there's one thing you take away from today, that would be my message. Show up and speak out.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi. Good morning. How are you? Thanks for carving out time for all of us today. My question is, many experts have said in the next 15, 20 years, the white American population will become the minority, coupled with a lot of generational shift in ideologies. And so that's a lot of things to happen all at once in the electorate. So my question is, how do you see that either clashing with, or what's your vision for how that's going to play out on the state level in your own Pennsylvania, Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, for example, in any future attempts to throw out electors at the state level when you've got the demographics shifting the way that it is. How will those two things, do you think, come together in the middle?
That's a great question. It may be that I think some of the speakers that are coming up after me, you should probably ask that of them as well, because I think, to me, I'm not sure. To me, it doesn't matter the demographics of the underlying population. I want everybody to, I want it to apply regardless of what the demographics are, right? And I know that's a bit of a simplistic answer, but I think the polling piece is actually, I think one of the next speakers can talk about polling, which I think gets more to your question, to the extent of when I talk about showing up and speaking out, like who's actually gonna be most likely to do that, and the holding accountable, right? So I don't care what the demographics are, as long as they do what we need them to do for this country. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, but I'd be interested to hear if you ask that same question of people who are in the polling realm, who are sort of testing messaging and getting a sense of how those changes in demographics are being felt and heard. I'd be interested to have a follow-up conversation.
Right. And my
Thank you.
apologies, representing Harvard Extension School.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Good morning, Ms. Boockvar.
Morning.
My name is Gabriela Bonilla. I'm an English education and literature major at Miami-Dade College. And you previously mentioned the decentralized nature of the voting process. And this can cause a lot of variability in things like barriers to voting, such as like voter ID laws. And I was wondering if you believe these barriers and how they differ are merely cultural differences, or if you have an angle to address them at either the local or federal level.
It's a great, you guys are just full of great questions. So, and I guess I didn't need to worry about people being shy, because clearly, can we take another hour for this class? What I would say is this. I think personally, there should be more baselines set at the federal level that apply to everyone. So while I think that there's added strength in the decentralization, I do feel like for most people, it doesn't feel right that if you happen to live in one town in one state, that you can vote by mail regardless of having a reason or not having a reason. In another place, everybody votes by mail. Like that's weird, right? For a country that we say, we all have, equal rights to vote. It's actually not, right? It's some people have greater access than others. So I would like to see some federal baselines more than we have now. We have some good stuff. We've got, good protections for voters with disabilities and, overseas and military voters and others. But I think we should do more at the federal level. And then I think we should have more clarity at the state levels too. And some states are a bit more, have a bit more regulatory or directive authority. So Pennsylvania could use more clarity. For example, the Secretary of State should be able to have more directive authority to tell the counties, all of you do this the same way, than actually they do. And so to me, we don't want to federalize elections. Like, absolutely, that's not the right answer. But fully localized differences also is not the right answer. So I feel like we need some of all of it playing a role.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, sir. And somebody from the Washington Center will give me the hook. Okay, thank you.
Hi, Kathy. I just want to say thank you so much again for all that you've shared with us today. My question is, well, first off, you spent a lot of time talking about truth winning and how the courts have proven that there was no fraud. My question is, when dealing with a constituency that sees these overturns as justification for corruption or proof of corruption and failure of our government, how can we, not only as people in this room, but as like future leaders, go about attempting to repair that negative perspective and make it so that they shift towards seeing the truth for what it really is? Do you have any strategies for that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it goes back to the people, the science, and the math, right? So I feel like it's much easier to tweet out a one-line conspiracy theory than it is to, I mean, how long did I just spend giving like an abbreviated version of how things work, right? We need to figure out short, sticky ways of just telling the actual information. And some of it is getting engaged too, right? So a lot of times when people become a poll worker or a poll watcher or somehow get engaged in the democratic process, they see how things work, and then that alone is reassuring, right? There was also more transparency since 2020 than there's ever been. You know, there were 24/7, webcams, overseeing counting of ballots, which, could put anybody to sleep. But if you want to stay up for it, it's very interesting to see. So I think we need to be more engaged. We need to be figuring out the short, sticky ways of talking about the people, the science, and the math, and all the different levels that go into making the election safe, secure, and accessible. And calling out lies when we see them. And whether that's a federal court, I mean, if you look at 60 plus court cases, mostly, frankly, overwhelmingly decided by federal judges, by Republican federal, state, and local judges. At some point, if you're not going to believe any of it, you're not going to believe any of it. But I'd say there's a good 30+% of the population who are confused, and we should be helping them understand how it really works.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, this is going to be the last question.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So. No pressure. Make it a good one.
Good morning. My name is Ahmed Al-Katabi, a journalism major and a student ambassador at the University of Arkansas Little Rock. My question is about Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, and the riot. In your opinion, what could have been the worst outcome, and how can we avoid it in the future?
Well, I think the worst outcome, you mean in 2020, I assume you're talking about, the worst outcome to me would have been overturning the will of the voters of the United States of America, right? It's sort of plain and simple to say, but that was really the goal, right? Was to literally subvert our entire system of democracy in this country. And yes, President Trump is a Republican, but this is not about Republican or Democratic in the sense of, George H.W. Bush, after he lost his effort to get a second term, he had this wonderful language after he lost that said, the people have spoken. He said, we need to respect the majesty of our democratic process. And that's all really we wanted to do, right? The people get to vote. The people get to vote in each state. We count the votes as election officials, and we make sure that the will of the people is who represents us in the White House, in the halls of Congress, and beyond, right? So I think all the things we talked about are ways that we need to prevent something like that happening again. I mentioned the reforms to the Electoral Count Act. I think that was arguably the most significant legislation we've seen in a very long time at the federal level. It's not sufficient in and of itself to prevent all disasters going forward, but it will certainly help a lot. And I was really pleased that they got it done, and I was sort of terrified that they wouldn't. So I think that will go a long way. But again, show up, speak out, call out lies when you see them, get engaged. All those things matter to help, make sure we've continued to have a healthy democracy. So America endured, but we can't assume that these kinds of efforts won't happen again. So thank you all. Thank you to Washington Center.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Washington Center, I want to thank you, Kathy Boockvar, for coming and really enlightening us about this very complicated process. Thank you.